If you are looking to put AI into your FlutterFlow project, then you have come to the right place. There's a fantastic template application which is dropped on the marketplace. It's a great example on how you can use ChatGPT inside your FlutterFlow application. We're going to take a bit of a quick look at the application. I'm also going to cover the use of the API as well, so please do stick around, and it should give you all of the info that you need to start including these type of functions into your own FlutterFlow project. So let's get cracking. So within inside the FlutterFlow marketplace, have a look. This is the project you're looking for. Just do a search for ChatGPT and this is what you'll come across. All you're going to need to do is clone the project up right there, give it a name, and then you're going to be able to fire it up yourself. So here we are with the application fired up in the test mode. Let's chuck a phrase at that and let's see what it says. So we're going to say, when did man walk on the moon? Hit the send button. We get a response back there. That's looking good. Who were they? So there we go. So we're able to hold a conversation with the ChatGPT API. So now let's move over to FlutterFlow itself. Let's have a little guided tour of how the application is shaped, and then we'll look at the API. So here we are in the widget tree. On the left hand side you can see that I've got the kind of the main screen that's been selected, and just one thing to point out here is that with this sample application is actually using new features of FlutterFlow where we've actually now got folders. So actually if you're looking to kind of group your pages into folders to kind of make it a little bit more organized, then just hit the little new folder icon up there and you can start now organizing your project a lot more slicker. So just down here in the widget tree here, so we've got some kind of like containers here that's kind of been named. And here we got our main sort of application column that kind of encompasses a number of other widgets here. So we've got our scrolling column, and within inside our scrolling column we've got some other widgets that are used primarily for kind of the setup at the top of the header there. So we've kind of got a desktop spacing. We've also got a desktop spacing here, which are just simply kind of containers. And within inside those particular containers, then what we're doing is we're actually responsively showing those depending on what device that you've got. So by simply selecting, say, this one down here, for example, you've got responsive visibility. So these won't be shown on a mobile application or a tablet. They'll be shown in landscape mode on a tablet, or they'll be shown on a desktop. So what's really great about kind of more responsive features inside FlutterFlow is that you can change the shape of your UI depending on which device your application is actually running on. So just bear that one for the future. This is a good sample of that being used here. Now within inside our column, obviously everything is therefore vertically stacked. So if I just collapse this down, that we can see here we've got two containers. So we've got our column here, and inside that we've got a number of widgets. We've also got a container at the bottom here. Now the container is where the user is going to obviously put their phrase in there. And then within inside that container, I can just open that up here. We've got a row. We have the text field there that takes up most of the space, and then we've got our icon button on the right hand side. That's the point, and that's the action that gets clicked that then invokes our API call to then populate the chat just above. And so talking of the chat just above, this is where it is in the widget tree here. We've got this this column here, which is inside the column. We've got these number of different kind of widgets. Now we're not too worried about, as I said, the desktop space or the row here, because it just kind of contains the icon and all that kind of stuff. But where we need to really focus our attention was inside this particular container here, and then we've actually got the list view. Now the list view is where kind of the main action occurs. So what the list view is going to be showing is the phrases and obviously the responses back from the ChatGPT API. So we'll delve into that a little bit more in a moment. So if inside this application there is some state that needs to be managed. So state is where we're going to actually store on the device the history and the phrases that kind of get created for us with inside the responses of the FlutterFlow API call. So we can see the state by clicking on the GPT flow kind of top level page there. We can move over to the state icon and we can see that we have the input content. So this is the phrase that is actually going to be recorded at this level here, and then we've got the chat history. The chat history is just something that we're going to be able to build up, and this is what is then bound to the list view, and obviously each of these is then displayed from that chat history. So we'll go through that very shortly. So next up, let's have a look at the API calls within inside FlutterFlow itself. So let's just choose the API calls option here on the left hand side. Now the way the API calls are set up in this particular sample is that we have a group, and then within inside that group we have then the API request that gets made. So the author has chosen to use a group here, which makes perfect sense, because what the group is actually doing is it's kind of the top level setup of our actual API call. So what's going to happen is then every kind of individual API call that you make underneath it is going to inherit parameters or values from the group that gets defined above. So if I just choose the OpenAI ChatGPT option there, you can see here that we've got a name and then we've got this base URL. So every single API request that sits underneath is going to start with the base URL, and then of course each API request is going to have its own reference to the specific API that it's actually calling. So just open that up here and you can see that now. You can see that actually here we've got the group name that's here, which was defined up here, and then we've got the specific API endpoint that is being called for each and individual one. So of course, as you build these up, you're going to obviously call different endpoints, but it's going to use sort of parameters from the parent. Now within inside this particular API call, there's some setup that we need to do. So it has a header. So the API key is something that's going to be issued to you from the OpenAI, the ChatGPT API. You're going to have to use that API, your own API within inside here. And what the header is just basically doing is it's just setting up an authorization sort of header, and then you then are going to fulfill the request by passing in the API into that header, and then of course that header would then handshake on the other end of OpenAI. It will be authorized, and then you'll get the response back. So you can see here that we have a body. So the body is kind of what we're going to be passing in. Now the body has to be very specific to the API that you're calling. So there's documentation on the OpenAI website that will give you kind of all of the information that you need in terms of what you need to pass in to get an accurate response back. If you don't pass the right body in, quite often APIs will turn around and reject the request that you're actually making. So in this particular body here, we've got a model. This is going to be very specific to OpenAI. You're going to need to include the value there. There's different values you can use here, but this is the kind of the more common one. And then here the messages is the prompt. So this is the JSON document. This is the kind of the data that you're going to pass into the API for that request to then carry out. We'll cover this very, very shortly. Now, some of these variables here that we've got set up here, these are the only two variables that we actually need, is the API key and the prompt, and these are defined within inside this particular section here. So you've got the API key variable set, which is a string. Of course, it doesn't have any default value, and the prompt again is that JSON document I was just telling you about, that kind of request body you're also going to need to include in the main body that you send to the API. So we'll show you how that is called very, very shortly. So let's move on now and let's see how this API is actually set up. So of course, if you are looking to include ChatGPT functions in your own applications, this is what you're going to need to do. You need to head over to this particular website. Of course, the link is in the description. Of course, you'll have it on screen as well. Head over to that particular website. Now, of course, at the time of recording, this is how the website looks, but of course, it may change over time depending when you watch. But click on the For Developers link. This will take you down to the bottom, and you want to hit on the Get Started option, and this will then fire you up to a particular screen which will allow you to either create a brand new account if you haven't already got one, or you can actually continue with a Google account. I've already got an account, so I'm just going to show you kind of what that looks like once you're actually signed in. So this is kind of the home page, and the bit that's quite important here is that there's obviously good documentation here and stuff, and I encourage you to explore the documentation. But up the top right here, you have this particular section here which actually has your API key. Now, of course, the API key is something we're going to need. The ChatGPT sample that's been provided as part of the template app already has an API key included. Now, typically in most sort of sample applications, you would need to be providing your own API key. So far, the API key that's been provided in the sample does work, but chances are that actually that API key will end up not being valid, because it could be that so many people end up using the sample that actually it gets overused, and the developers would need to pull it. So what I encourage you to do is generate your own API key. The OpenAI platform does provide, generally will provide you with some credit to actually use, just so you can use again, as often as you would like. But of course, once you exceed the amount of requests, then there's often a charge that would incur. Now, the cost of using ChatGPT is really, really small. So if you are looking to include this sort of features inside your application, it's actually quite a cost-effective API to use. But you need to go over to the View API keys here. I've already got mine just already set up, and what I would do is I'd be copying this key now. So when you go to create a new key, it will actually generate that key for you. So make sure you copy that and include that somewhere safe, because you're going to need to use that with inside FlutterFlow. So I've already got my key already in my clipboard, so I'm going to be able to replace the API key now with inside the ChatGPT FlutterFlow project. So let's do that now. So with inside FlutterFlow, the API key is set up with inside this icon button. Now it's the icon button that's going to kick off an action, and the action is then going to make this API call. So just make sure the icon button is selected, and then with inside here, we just want to choose the actual action flow editor. So just open that up, and then you can see exactly what's happening here. So this is where the magic is happening. This is where the API call is being made. So you just want to make sure that's selected. And here are the two variables I was talking about with inside the API request that you have just seen. So the API key is the one that you're going to want to choose, so just select that, and then here is the value that's been provided as part of the sample. What you kind of want to do is you want to kind of put your own one in there, so just put our own one in there. So there's my API key, so that's in there, that's ready to go. So I can just hit close. What I suggest you do is actually test this out. Once you change that API key, move into test mode, and let's give it a whirl and let's see if it works for us. So here we go with inside test mode. Let's put our term in here. So what is FlutterFlow? Hit the send, and fingers crossed we should get a response back. And this is now using our own API key. Excellent. So everything is all plumbed in using our own API key. One gotcha though. One thing I do want to point out here is that actually, depending on when you created your account, sometimes you might actually have credit available, sometimes you don't. So if you hit send there and you don't get a response back, and you kind of think, what's going on here? It could well be that an error is being returned back from the OpenAPI. One way to spot that is if you do an F12, you'll find there'll be an error here. There will be like a 429 or something like that. You'll see it be in red. It'll be quite prominent. And what that often means, if you actually move over to your your billing. So if I go over to my usage here, you'll see here that actually it would actually be 0. Now the API key that I'm using at the moment is from one of my other accounts, which is like a pay for account. But so just bear in mind that if you don't see any sort of any value here, you'll find that you won't have any credit to make that request. So it's just a little gotcha there, just to be careful of if you're not finding you're getting a response back. So back in the widget tree here, we've got the icon button selected. Let's have a look at the custom functions that this application now has. Now there is 2 custom functions that they're quite simple to understand. So let's have a quick look at those. So on the left hand side, let's just choose custom functions, and we have 2. We've got one that's called convert to JSON and one that's called save chat history. Now convert to JSON is just a simple sort of function here that what it's doing is it's taking in our prompt. This is taking in our string that the user would type actually into the search box at the bottom. And what it's doing is it's just going to return back a more of a shaped sort of string that contains a little bit more data that's needed in order to pass it into the API. So here you can see here that it's actually got, looks like it's building up a JSON kind of a string, which includes the prompt actually to be included. So this prompt value here will be included here. And then we're going to return back something that looks a little bit like this here. You could just see that here. And of course, it's this that is then passed into our API itself. So if you go back to the API calls and click on here and click on send full prompt and go to the body, it's that's going to be passed in at this particular stage. Now, if you were to go to the OpenAI actual API reference, I'm just going to show you that now. So you go up to documentation with inside the OpenAI platform itself. You move down to chat, and this is the API call that we're actually calling here. Okay, and you can see here this is giving you a bit of a sample to what we're actually passing in. So we know that we're passing in the model, which is just something we're passing in that's required, and then of course the messages itself. So just go back to here. There is the messages there. Go back to the reference. that's what we're using here. That's the key. And you can see here that in this particular sample here, it's showing you the same as what we've got here. Here is the model, and here is that JSON string that's also been included as well. So we know we need to include this by standard, and then of course content is hello. This of course is going to be the phrase that you're going to actually pass in at the bottom there. So I just wanted to point that out. It's definitely well worth going and have a look at the documentation. That'll really kind of help you understand. And of course what it also shows you then is the response that actually comes back as well. So you can see here that we've got a bit of content. We'll be referencing that actually as a response very, very shortly. So it's worth getting yourself familiar with this kind of message structure that kind of comes back. And of course, it's the content that comes back is what we're then going to then add into our chat history. So moving back to FlutterFlow then, let's move back to where we were. Let's move up to the actual to custom functions, just choose that there, and let's have a look at the save chat history. Now what save chat history is just going to do for us is just going to keep repeatedly adding the JSON response that we get come back from our API. It's just going to keep building up the history local state there with the new values. And the best way to probably demonstrate that is actually if I just pop over to the sample here. What I've done here is I've just passed a couple of requests into the API, and you can see here that the first request that I made was really just a simple kind of message. So it's just how many miles to the moon, and I've just passed that single one in. Of course, I've come along again and I've then added another sort of phrase in there, and then what we've passed then is we then passed the additional messages. So you can see here we've got this message here, this message here. So what's going to keep happening is every time you make a request to the ChatGPT API, you're going to pass in all of the messages that has come before. So that way then the ChatGPT system will know about the conversation, and then will then provide more accurate responses on the way back. So that's all that particular function is doing. It's just kind of allowing us to kind of build up this list of this historic chat that we can then pass back into our API request. So let's move back then to the actual action flow editor now. So we know that we've got the success come back. We know that we've made the API call. We know that we're at this particular stage where we're down in this position, that we've got a response back. What do we do there? So really all we are doing here is taking the JSON response that we got to come back from the API, and we're just loading it up into the chat history. So this is where we are invoking our save chat history, a custom function that you've just seen. And really all we're doing is we're just passing in the actual chat history and then the new chat as well. So this is the value that is coming back from the API response. So you can see here that we're just moving our way down to the actual messages itself. So here we've just got there's an array that comes back within the choices. In fact, if I show you back into the documentation here, we've got the choices. This is an array. So this is the first position within inside our array. We're moving down into messages and we're pulling out our content. So that's exactly the way that is operating here. We're into choices, we're into the position 0, which is our first entry, and then we're pulling out the message, and we're just passing that actually in as a parameter into our function, into the actual the save chat history. So that's pretty well much all that we're doing in this particular stage. We're just going to gradually keep adding to that list. So let's just cancel that. And then finally, we're doing clear text fields. Of course, this is where the user just typed in a prompt. We want to clear it straight away once that's happened, so we don't have any sort of standing text in there. And then we're waiting. There's a delay of like 800 milliseconds there, and then scroll to. All that's really doing is if you had a big long chat with inside the list view and you sort of scroll to a different position, when you actually type into the prompt, you hit the send, you want the list view to scroll back to the position of where the latest chat would be added from the response. So it's a great way to handle the list view positioning there. So that is that. And just finally, the last thing to probably talk about is actually the list view, because this is kind of where we're now going to be displaying the content that comes back. So you can see here on the right hand side, we've got the generate dynamic children. We've got a chat variable. So each one of these will be a chat will be populated in the variable of the chat that comes back. And then that's all from our chat history. So really all we're doing, we're just going through our list. Every single entry within inside our list will become a chat variable. Of course, then that is then referenced within inside each of these particular rows. let's just drill down into those rows so we can see how that happens. So let's just move to the actual container here. We've got a column, we've got the text, we've got the content. So we just go up to here and we can see that the JSON path that we're actually putting out is obviously the root. So we're right at that point of the content. So we just go back to the API reference. We can see here, we're right at this particular point here. So it's this is the key, and this is the value that we're going to be pulling out by setting that here. So $content, we'll pull that out. So we're right really low into the JSON response that comes back at this particular stage. So we kind of got that again on the right hand side here. So we know that as this list is being built up for us in this save chat history, every single record will then be referenced by the same variable. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed watching this video. This is a great sample project to kickstart your AI minds. There's so much more that you can do with AI inside your applications. Of course, the key to it is using the OpenAI system. Of course, the API endpoints, there's so many more that you can actually use. So please do have a look at the documentation. It's really, really useful. Just kind of get your head around it. And I'm sure that you'll be taking your applications to the next level. Please do like this video. I really, really, really do appreciate your likes. It really, really helps the channel out. And of course, please do subscribe as well. There's going to be so many more of these types of videos coming in the not too distant future, where we'll take a look at the templates. Well, as they come out and they get introduced, I'll take a closer look at them for you and share my experience. So yeah, until the next one, we'll see you real soon.